Hello, Econ students. Mr. Ling here with unit number 5. This is actually the shortest unit in all of macroeconomics. There's only one quiz, and half of the concepts are review. Happy Thanksgiving. This is going to be good. There's one kind of big thing that we are actually going to go over this video, which is the Phillips curve, brand new curve. Really, really important curve and mastery concept for sure. But outside of that, really, we're just dealing with kind of the nuances of stuff we've already talked about. So let us dive in. First, concept 5.1 is fiscal and monetary policy and the impact in the short run. You actually know this already. We're just going to combine the two and take a look at what actually happens when we use fiscal and monetary policy. So, like the great superheroes of Batman and Robin. Does Robin still exists in the modern Batman? I don't think he does. You should figure that out. Cool outfit too, right? Robin doesn't get enough credit. I'm just saying. So we have fiscal and monetary policy actually work together. Economists recommend a combination of the two because fiscal policy has the certainty you need because we know when the government spends money or decreases taxes, it's going to have an impact on the economy, but it also creates debt. So where monetary policy lacks that certainty, it creates no new debt. And so by using both of these in concert together, you kind of get the best of both worlds. We have the certainty brought to you by fiscal policy. We have the maybe not so certain because banks don't have to lend it out, but it definitely doesn't create debt. So combine those two and we can do more with less debt. That's the idea. So put it all together and let's look at expansionary policy for monetary and fiscal policy. You know these already. Expansionary fiscal policy to fix recessionary gaps is going to be to decrease taxes, which increases consumption, or increase government spending, which increases government spending. Those two things actually shift aggregate demand to the right, closing recessionary gaps. Monetary policy is same idea. We're trying to shift aggregate demand, but we do it through increasing the supply of money. Remember, there are three tools. There you go. There's a three that increases supply of money. You can buy bonds. Remember, buy big. I take bonds out of the spreadsheets for businesses or balance sheets for banks, and I replace it with excess reserves that they can then lend out. Lower the reserve ratio, which gives them more excess reserves and allows them to lend more out, and lower the discount rate, which allows them to borrow more from the Fed and lend that out. All three of those things create an increase in supply of money. Of course, the logic is you increase supply of money, interest rates fall, investment rises, aggregate demand shifts to the right. Contractionary policy, all the same things, but different. Just reverse it. For fiscal policy, you're going to decrease government spending, increase taxes. Those two things will shift aggregate demand to the left because G and C of Sig-Jigson are falling. And then monetary policy, you're going to decrease the supply of money. Contractionary monetary policy, contracting the supply of money. We have three things we can do that contract supply of money. You can sell bonds by putting bonds into balance sheets and taking excess reserves out. You pull down the loanable funds, the supply of money decreases. You can increase the reserve ratio. By increasing the reserve ratio, you are going to require banks to set more money aside and require reserves, lowering their excess reserves and giving them less loanable funds, or increase a discount rate, which makes it less likely they borrow from the Fed and lend it out. All three of those things decrease the supply of money. Of course, the logic from there is when you shift supply of money left, you increase interest rates, which decreases investment, which shifts aggregate demand to the left, closing inflationary gaps. Those are basically, that's like half of macroeconomics in one slide right there, right? So let's take a look at this and look at kind of the nuanced impact in the short run when we're using these kind of fiscal policies. So if we have a negative output gap, which is just a fancy way of saying we have a recession, what's going to happen? What type of policies are we going to implement? And the answer is, of course, expansionary fiscal and monetary policy. Expansionary fiscal, we just talked about, increasing government spending, decreasing taxes. Expansionary monetary policy, we just talked about, buy bonds, lower the reserve ratio, lower the discount rate, shifting supply to the right, pushing interest rates down, pushing investment up, shifting aggregate demand to the right. Both of these actions will shift aggregate demand to the right. So as a result of this shift of aggregate demand to the right, what's going to happen to all of the following? Well, first, in order to shift aggregate demand to the right, we had to increase the supply of money. Makes sense, right? So we increase the supply of money. Well, what happened to interest rates when we did that? Well, supply money looks like this. Supply money went to the right. Supply money went to the right. Interest rates fell. Of course, that's what happened. When interest rates fall, supply money goes right. What happens to the loans that are given out by banks? Those have to increase. That's kind of the logic here, right? Banks have more money to give out because they have more excess reserves, so loans are going up. What happens to price level or inflation? Well, of course, when aggregate demand goes to the right, price level goes from down here to up here. Price level is rising. What about GDP? Of course, GDP went from QY to QFE, so GDP is rising. What about the unemployment rate? Remember, GDP and unemployment have an inverse relationship. When GDP goes up, unemployment rates go down because more people are getting hired. And then budget surplus. What are you talking about here? Well, if we had a surplus, which means the money or the government brought in more money than they paid out, right? When we participate in expansionary fiscal policy, increasing government spending, decreasing taxes, that costs more money and we have less revenue coming in. So any surplus we had before is going away, is decreasing, which means that our national debt is actually rising because we're spending more, we're bringing in less revenue, so we have more debt. So fiscal policy, monetary policy has significant short run consequences. Later on, we're going to talk about those long run consequences. But for now, let's take that same idea and look at the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve is named after Mr. Phillips. I just made that up. I really should look that up, though. I've been teaching this many years. Who came up with Phillips curve? I'm guessing it's Mr. Phillips, Professor Phillips, maybe. Dr. Phillips? Hmm. Anyways, for the Phillips curve, it's actually a quite simple graph, but there's a couple of tricky things. It's concept 5.2, bonus concept. It's super important. We're going to spend a little time here and we'll practice it for sure in class. All right, so what is the Phillips curve? The Phillips curve actually shows a trade off that only happens in the short run between inflation and unemployment. If you think about it, when average demand shifts to the right, inflation is going up. The GDP is rising too, which means that unemployment is going down. So we have an inverse relationship there, and vice versa. When average demand shifts left, we know inflation or price levels going down, but unemployment rates are going up. Inverse relationship. So, I just talked about that. Dang it. Answer my question before the animation came up. Should I redo the whole video? Comment below. There's no comment button, but I feel like that's what people do on YouTube. Maybe I should start doing that. All right, anyways. In general, there's an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. Check this graph out here, going all the way up to 2009, which I realize now is super dated. But notice if the blue is my unemployment rate and the red is my inflation rate, when unemployment rises, inflation falls. When unemployment falls, inflation rises. We know this already. We talked about this on the business cycle, right? When we have an inflationary gap, inflation's high, unemployment's low. We have a recessionary gap, unemployment's high, inflation is low. You know this relationship well. You also know that an inverse relationship shows up like this. This is the short run Phillips curve. Inflation is on the y axis, which should make some sense, right? Y axis is always price. And here, the rising of price level is inflation. So inflation is always going to be on the y-axis. Unemployment's on the x-axis. Again, some logic here. GDP is what impacts unemployment or quantity produced. Unemployment is also indicated by GDP, so it's going to be on our x-axis. So inflation and unemployment are the two. Put it all together and show that inverse relationship and short run Phillips curve, we label it SRPC, short run Phillips curve, is downward slope. So when the economy is doing really well, or inflationary, sorry, overheating, we have an inflationary gap. We're going to have very, very low unemployment, maybe like 2%, or very, very high inflation, maybe like 5%. So see, we have low unemployment, it's actually lower than the natural rate. We have high inflation of 5%. So an inflationary gap is indicated as being at the top of the hill of the short run Phillips curve. It might even be helpful to think of this like the bottom half of the business cycle, right? Where we're, change colors here, where we're like here for an inflationary gap, which is by the peak, right? And we're down here for the recessionary gap, which is by the trough, right? So if you just kind of zoom in here, That's kind of like your Phillips curve. That might be an easy way to think of it. Inflationary gaps are always going to be at the top of the hill because they're near the peak business cycle. And recessionary gaps are going to be at the bottom of the hill because they're at the bottom, they're near the trough, right? Recession. Okay, so speaking of that, when there is a recession, unemployment rate is going to be very high, like this, 9%, higher than the natural rate of unemployment. Inflation is going to be very low, like maybe 1%. That shows us those two areas. So a recession is always going to be on the bottom right, bottom of the hill, and our inflation is always going to be on the top left, top of the hill. So far, so good. Now, what happens when aggregate supply falls, causing stagflation? Well, when stagflation occurs, we know unemployment rate is going up, and we know inflation rate is going up. Sorry, I had cotton in my mouth for a second. In other words, in other words, inflation and unemployment are moving in the same direction. So, for example, if I start at this 5, I have unemployment rate is rising, inflation rate is also rising. And now I have some sort of wayward point out here. What's happening there? Well, I must have a shift. I guess I didn't drop far enough. I have a shift in SRPC. In other words, when our demand shifts right or left, inflationary, recessionary gap, we're going to have movement along the curve. When our supply shifts right or left, we no longer have that inverse relationship. It's actually going to be a shift of the SRPC, a shift to the right when our supply shifts left and vice versa. Remember, you're thinking inflation and unemployment. What's happening to those? Well, in stagflation, we know both are going up, but it has to be a shift. When our supply shifts right, like with economic growth, we know both are going down. And so short run Phillips curve has to shift left. Okay. So again, think what's happening to unemployment, what's happening to inflation, and then apply it to the graph and you'll be in good shape. Okay, another thing you need to know is that there's actually a long run Phillips curve, and it looks like long run average supply. It's a vertical curve, right? Because in the long run, you know this already, there is no trade off between inflation and unemployment. Price level will go up and down, but unemployment rate always returns to the natural rate of unemployment. So, what's the natural rate of unemployment for this nation? Of course, it's 5%. The natural rate of unemployment is where the long run Phillips curve is. Just like long run average supply is located at full employment GDP, long run Phillips curve is located at the natural rate of unemployment, which is found at the full employment GDP. And the logic behind this is simple. Average demand shifts right, price level goes up, right? Unemployment rate goes down, but leave it alone, supply takes it home, average supply will shift left. And when average supply shifts left, short run Phillips curve will shift to the right, getting us back to long run Phillips curve. Inflation will go up and down. Unemployment rate will always return to the natural rate of unemployment. That's why we have the long run Phillips curve there. Oh, I just said that. LRPC is at the natural rate of unemployment. All right, let's try one out. And again, we're going to practice this a whole lot more. But let's try this out. Let's see if we can place these points on a graph. So I'm going to put in inflation right here, INF. I'm going to lower the size of this. And down here, I'm going to put unemployment. That's supposed to say unemployment. All right, let's get a different color here. How about some green? I'm going to have my downward sloping SRPC, indicating the inverse relationship in the short run between inflation and unemployment. And then I'm going to have, let's go orange. I'm going to have my LRPC right here. This is long run Phillips curve. Now up here, it tells me my natural rate of unemployment is 5%. So I can actually come right here and label this as 5% because I know long run Phillips curve is always going to be at the natural rate of unemployment. So far, so good. Now I need a graph point A. At point A, let's change the color here. Let's go blue. Point A, inflation is 15%, unemployment is 2%. Well, I have one indicator of unemployment already, 5%, and now 2% has to be over here. So I dash up until I hit the curve. I'll call this point A. And I dash over, and this must be 15% unemployment because that's what they told me it was. 15%. What kind of a gap do I have here? Well, of course, I have an inflationary gap. I'm at the top of the hill. Inflation rates are high, unemployment rates are lower than the natural rate of unemployment. All right, can I do B? Well, let's switch over. Let's do purple, pink, magenta. At B, the inflation rate is 3%, unemployment rate is 12%. Again, I have my frame of reference with the natural rate of unemployment. 12% is going to be higher than that. It's going to be over here. And then I dash up until I hit the short run Phillips curve. I'm going to call this B. And then B, there we go. And then I dash over. And of course, this is going to be at 3% inflation. What do I have there? Of course, I have a recessionary gap because the unemployment rate is super high and I'm at the bottom of the hill near the trough. Then point C right here, we'll do, let's do full on red for this one. Point C right here, it says our inflation rate is 7%, my unemployment rate is 5%. Ding, 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 5% is my natural rate of unemployment. So I know 5%, I dash up until I hit the curve. I dash over, my inflation rate must be 7%, my natural rate of unemployment, and I label this as point C. Notice we have an inflationary gap is to the left along the curve, a recessionary gap is to the right along the curve or bottom of the hill, and then full employment is at the intersection between LRPC and SRPC. In fact, I could draw these same points on an aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph, which we'll do here in a minute. All right, let's keep going. Maybe. There we go. All right, let's try one more. We'll make this one a little simpler. So we have inflation right here, a little quicker this time. We have unemployment down here, unemployment. We have a downward sloping SRPC, inverse relationship there. We have a vertical LRPC. They tell us our natural rate of unemployment is 5%. So down here, this is going to be 5%. That's our natural rate of unemployment. I jump over here to the left, and it says point A, my inflation rate is 6%, my unemployment rate is 5%. So I jump here, unemployment rate 5%. Oh, that's my natural rate of unemployment. I always have to be in the short run, so they must be giving me my long run equilibrium. I dash over, and that's 6% from point A at the intersection. Now it says that inflation goes to 11%, unemployment rate goes to 12%. Well, I have my frame of reference with the unemployment rate, 5%. So I jump over here. Let's do this in, let's do green. So I jump over here. I know 12% is way over here, 12%. But my inflation rate is way up here at like 11%. If I dash this over and I dash this up, I get a random point way out here for point B. What just happened? Well, of course, my short run Phillips curve has shifted. How do I know that? Well, notice unemployment rate went up from 5% to 12%. Inflation rate went up. When both of those are happening, I have stagflation occurring. Okay, not so bad. Know the inverse relationship, know where long run Phillips curve is, know where an inflationary gap or recessionary gap is, and then know how to demonstrate stagflation. Again, we'll do several examples of this in class. Okay. Now, I told you before you can put these side by side. We're going to go through this relatively quickly because we're going to spend some time on this in class. But notice when I'm at full employment GDP here, triple intersection, my unemployment rate is at the natural rate of unemployment. So I have to be right here at the intersection for SRPC and LRPC, right? When aggregate demand shifts to the right, I have an inflationary gap. Check it. Price level went up. GDP went up, which meant unemployment rate is going down. If inflation is going up and unemployment here, do it here. If inflation is going up and unemployment rate is going down, then my second point must be upward towards the left, an inflationary gap, moving to the top of the hill. So inflationary gap here, moving to the top left. Okay, it's kind of like a reflection. Okay, let's try another one here. We have a recessionary gap here, which means that my current GDP is below my full employment GDP, which means my unemployment rate is high. What's going to happen? Well, I start at an inflation or recessionary gap, the bottom of the hill near the trough in a recession, right? Unemployment rate is high, price level is relatively low, and we're definitely not at long run equilibrium. Then when aggregate demand shifts to the left, it's a recession getting worse. What's happened here? Well, price level went down. So we know here, inflation, this is how I always do it, inflation is going down, downward. GDP went down, so that means unemployment must be rising. So I'm going to show a point moving to the lower right of this curve, and that will be my further recession or larger recessionary gap as a result. So remember, I always ask three questions. One, what's happening to inflation? Two, what's happening to unemployment? And then three, how do I demonstrate that from my current point? Right? Just reading your graph, drawing in your arrows will get you to the right answer every stinking time. Okay, one more. Let's say we are at triple intersection here, so I have to draw that on a Phillips curve. Of course, I'm at the natural rate of unemployment, so that means I must be at long run equilibrium for LRPC as well. Now, when average supply shifts to the left, check it. Price level went up. GDP went down, which meant that unemployment rate went up. So both inflation and unemployment are rising. So again, I like doing it this way. I know inflation went up. I know unemployment went up. So I'm going to have some sort of point over here in the ether. What happened? Well, that must have been a shift to the right in SRPC. So when our supply shifts left, SRPC is going to shift to the right. Notice my unemployment rate is greater than my natural rate of unemployment, but my inflation rate is now higher than it was before, indicating stagflation. Okay, friends. Oh, we got one more. All right, let's say we have this recessionary gap here. Again, we know how to show recessionary gaps. We've shown it many times. Let's say if you leave it alone, supply takes it home. So we know average supply is shifting to the right. Ask your questions. Number one, what happens to inflation? Well, price level went down. So inflation rate is going down. So down. Okay. Well, GDP went up. So unemployment rate is also going down. Boom. I know I'm ending up at the full employment GDP, so I must be at the natural rate, which means that the only way to demonstrate a rightward shift in average supply is to show a leftward shift in SRPC, getting us back to full employment GDP. Okay, that's it. Check out that Khan Academy. That's kind of a lot, but we'll break it down a little bit in class and we'll try and practice that often. All right, enjoy the rest of your day. I will see you real